Have you ever felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on you? Not in admiration, but in judgment. A heavy, suffocating pressure that pins you in place, making every breath a conscious effort. Have you ever stood alone with your heart pounding a frantic rhythm against your ribs, knowing that the single choice you are about to make will sever the last thread connecting you to the world? Most of us haven't. Most of us live our lives in the comfortable gray spaces between defiance and conformity. But our story today isn't about most of us. It's about a woman who stood in the blistering sun of a forgotten town and chose to walk directly into the fire. The town was called Redemption Gulch, a name so steeped in irony it was almost a joke. There was no redemption here, only dust and desperation. The sun beat down on the parched earth with a relentless fury, baking the ground into a cracked, pale canvas. The air hung thick and heavy, tasting of grit and the faint metallic scent of despair. Today, that air was also thick with anticipation. The town square, a generous term for the trampled patch of dirt between the general store and Marshal Thorne's office, was more crowded than it had been in months. Farmers and faded denim ranchers with leather-worn faces and townsfolk in their Sunday best, gone to seed, gathered in tight, murmuring clusters. They were drawn together not by a festival or a visiting preacher, but by the raw, ugly spectacle of a man's life being sold for the price of a few stolen goods. At the center of it all, standing on the slightly raised porch of the marshal's office, was the man himself, Marshal Thorne. His silver badge was the only thing in the entire town that seemed to truly shine, catching the harsh sunlight and flinging it back with cold indifference. Beside him, bound in heavy, rusted chains that seemed a cruel mockery in the oppressive heat, stood the prisoner. He was a specter, a man who seemed carved from the very rock and shadow of the unforgiving lands beyond the town's edge. He was of the people, the displaced tribes the townsfolk spoke of in hushed, fearful whispers. They called his kind savages a word spat out like a curse. He stood tall, his shoulders broad, despite the way the chains forced them to slump. His skin was the color of rich earth weathered by sun and wind, and his dark hair, unbound, fell like a silken curtain past his shoulders, a stark contrast to the sweat-stained collars of the men who stared at him. But it was his eyes that held you. They were dark, deep-set, and held a stillness that was more unsettling than any show of rage. He didn't plead, he didn't curse, he didn't even flinch as the murmur of the crowd washed over him. He simply stood a pillar of silent dignity in a sea of jeering contempt. His wrists were raw, rubbed bloody by the iron shackles, a testament to a struggle that had happened somewhere unseen, but his gaze was steady, sweeping over the faces before him as if he were the one judging them. "All right, folks, settle down." Marshal Thorne's voice boomed, a gravelly mix of legal authority and a showman's flair. "Got a real prize for you today. Caught this one red-handed skulking around Silas Blackwood's prize stallion." A clear case of attempted thievery. A ripple of angry muttering went through the crowd. Silas Blackwood was the most powerful man in the valley. He owned the bank, half the businesses, and held the mortgage on nearly every piece of land, including the one belonging to Elara Vance. To cross Blackwood was to invite ruin. "The circuit judge says he's to be sold." Thorne continued, a grim smile playing on his lips. "Indentured servitude to cover the cost of the trouble he's caused, and to serve as a lesson. We'll start the bidding at $100. $100 for a strong back. Think of the work he can do in the mines or breaking wild horses. Lord knows his kind are good with animals when they ain't stealing 'em." "Beast," someone yelled from the crowd. "Godless heathen," another added. The words were stones thrown with vicious intent, but the man in chains remained impassive. His dark eyes continued their slow, deliberate survey of the crowd. It was then that his gaze met hers. Elara Vance stood at the edge of the crowd near the water trough. She hadn't wanted to come. The town's gatherings had become a source of pain for her, a reminder of all she had lost. 3 years. It had been 3 years since her husband Liam had been lowered into the dry, unforgiving ground of Redemption Gulch. He wasn't a rancher by birth, but a teacher from the East, a man who believed in books and fairness and the inherent goodness of people, a belief that this town had slowly, brutally crushed. He died from a snakebite, a simple thing that could have been treated if Doc Adams hadn't been passed out drunk in his office. The town had shrugged. These things happened. But for Elara, it was the moment the world had cracked open, revealing a core of callous indifference she could never unsee. She had stayed clinging to the ranch they had built together, the Lone Cypress Ranch, named for the single defiant tree that grew on a ridge overlooking their small house. She stayed because leaving felt like letting Liam die a second time. But the struggle was relentless. The well was failing, the fences were collapsing, and the shadow of Silas Blackwood's mortgage loomed larger with each passing season. She looked at the man in chains, and she didn't see a savage. She saw the town's hypocrisy made flesh. They condemned this man for a crime they hadn't even seen yet. The town's own doctor could let a good man die through negligence and still be invited to Sunday dinner. She saw the same cold indifference that had stolen her husband, now directed at this stranger. And in his eyes, in that deep, unnerving stillness, she saw something else, a spirit that refused to be broken. A spirit that reminded her painfully of Liam. $100, Thorne called out again. Who'll start us at 100? Silas Blackwood, standing near the front, gave a smug nod to one of his ranch hands. 100, the hand called out dutifully. 100 it is, Thorne grinned. Do I hear 120? The crowd was silent. No one else had the money or the nerve to bid against Blackwood. It was a foregone conclusion. The man would be sent to Blackwood's silver mine, a place from which few men, white or native, ever returned healthy. He would be worked to death, another forgotten soul crushed under the heel of Redemption Gulch. A tremor went through Elara's hand. She clutched the worn leather purse at her side. Inside was $150. Everything. Every last cent she had saved for winter supplies, for a new pump, for the well, for the faint, desperate hope of survival. Using it would be madness. It would be ruin. Don't do it, Elara. A voice in her head, the voice of reason, of survival, whispered, You have yourself to think of. You can't save the world. But another voice, a quieter one that sounded achingly like Liam, spoke too. What is survival worth if you have to kill a piece of your soul to achieve it? 100 going once. Thorne began raising his gavel. The man in chains finally blinked. His gaze, which had been sweeping the crowd, settled back on her. It wasn't a plea. It was a look of quiet, profound understanding, as if he saw the war raging inside her, as if he knew what this was costing her. And in that moment, her choice was made. Don't hurt him. The words were a whisper, barely audible. She cleared her throat, and the sound of it was like a stranger in her own body. She took a step forward, the crowd parting before her with bewildered expressions. Don't hurt him, she said again, her voice ringing out clear and steady in the sudden, absolute silence. Every head turned. Marshal Thorne's jaw went slack. Silas Blackwood's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. Elara Vance, the quiet widow, the woman who had faded into the background for 3 long years, walked toward the porch. Her heart was a wild bird beating against her ribs, but her chin was high. She met the prisoner's gaze, and then Marshal Thorne's. I'll buy him, she declared, and the words echoed across the silent square. A stone dropped into a still stagnant pond. The shock was palpable. It hung in the air thicker than the dust itself. A woman, a widow, bidding on a savage. It was unheard of. It was scandalous. It was to the people of Redemption Gulch, the act of a madwoman. The music swells slightly, a tone of suspense and determination. What drives a person to risk everything for a complete stranger? Was it madness, or was it the last desperate act of a soul refusing to be extinguished? Elara Vance had just declared war on the entire town, on its most powerful man, and on the crushing weight of its prejudice. And this was only the beginning. If you want to find out what happens when a lone woman's courage meets a town's collective hatred, and to follow this incredible story of defiance and redemption, make sure you subscribe to our channel and click that notification bell. You won't want to miss a single moment of what comes next. The silence that followed Elara's declaration was a living thing. It was a dense, heavy blanket that smothered the town square, punctuated only by the buzzing of a lone fly and the distant rhythmic creak of the blacksmith's hammer falling silent. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. The crowd was a tableau of disbelief, a collection of gaping mouths and wide, unblinking eyes, all fixed on the solitary figure of the widow Vance. She stood there, a woman in a faded calico dress that had seen too many seasons of grief and hard work, her auburn hair pulled back in a severe bun that did little to soften the fierce determination etched onto her face. She looked small and fragile against the harsh backdrop of the sun-bleached buildings, yet her presence seemed to fill the entire square. Marshal Thorne was the first to recover. A slow, incredulous smile stretched beneath his thick mustache. He looked from Elara to Silas Blackwood, as if seeking confirmation that he hadn't just imagined the whole thing. "Now hold on a minute, Mrs. Vance," he said, his tone a patronizing drawl meant to gently dismiss a confused child. "This ain't a church social. This here is a dangerous criminal. Not the sort of project for a lady to take on." "Call him savage all you want," Marshal Elara's voice cut through his condescension, sharp and clean as glass. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, never left the prisoner's face. "I see a man worth saving." A collective gasp went through the women of the town. Prudence Miller, the banker's wife, and the self-appointed guardian of the town's morality, pressed a hand to her chest in theatrical shock. "Elara, have you taken complete leave of your senses?" she hissed, loud enough for everyone to hear. Elara ignored her. She ignored all of them. Her focus was singular. She looked back at Thorne, her gaze unwavering. "Mr. Blackwood's man bid 100. I bid 120. She reached into her worn purse, her hand steady now, and pulled out a small, heavy cloth pouch. The clink of the coins inside was a stark, solid sound in the charged silence. Silas Blackwood, who had been watching the scene with a look of cold amusement, now stepped forward. He was a big man, broad and imposing in a fine black coat that seemed to absorb the sunlight and give nothing back. His face was a mask of calculated civility, but his eyes were like chips of gray granite. "Elara," he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather, yet carrying an unmistakable undertone of threat. "While your charity is admirable, perhaps it is misplaced. This is a matter of town security. A matter for men to handle." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "Let me take this burden off your hands. For Liam's sake. He was a friend, and I wouldn't want to see his widow get into trouble she can't handle." The mention of Liam was a deliberate, cruel stroke. It was meant to remind her of her vulnerability, of her status as a grieving, helpless widow, but it had the opposite effect. The memory of her husband, of his quiet strength, and his belief in doing what was right, no matter the cost, solidified her resolve into something as hard and unyielding as granite. "Liam taught me that a person's worth isn't determined by the color of their skin or the judgment of a crowd," she said, her voice low but resonant. "And he also taught me to recognize a wolf when I see one, no matter how fine a coat he wears. $130, Marshal." The insult, though veiled, was clear. A dark flush crept up Blackwood's neck. His jaw tightened, and for a moment the mask of civility slipped, revealing the raw, predatory anger beneath. The crowd held its breath. They had just witnessed the unthinkable. The quiet widow Vance had not only defied Silas Blackwood, she had insulted him in public. Thorne, caught between his fear of Blackwood and his duty to the law, began to sweat. The auction was legal. A bid was a bid. I have 130 from Mrs. Vance," he stammered, looking nervously at Blackwood. "Do I hear 140? Blackwood's ranch hand looked at his boss, awaiting the signal. Blackwood gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. His eyes, fixed on Elara, were filled with a cold, calculating fury. He was a man who played long games. He could have easily outbid her, but this was a public humiliation. He would let her have her hollow victory. He would let her buy the savage, and then he would make her pay for it slowly and completely. He would take her ranch, crush her spirit, and make her an example to anyone else who dared to defy him. "Going once," Thorne said, his voice trembling slightly. "Going twice." He looked around the silent, stunned crowd. "Sold to Mrs. Elara Vance for $130. He slammed his gavel down with a crack that made everyone jump. The tension in the square didn't break. It shattered. The crowd erupted into a maelstrom of angry, disbelieving whispers. "Madness! She's signed her own death warrant. Bringing that thing into her home, she'll be murdered in her sleep." The words flew at her, a barrage of fear and prejudice. But Elara didn't hear them. She walked to the porch, her head held high, and placed the cloth pouch of coins into Marshal Thorne's sweating palm. "The bill of sale will be ready in my office," Thorne grumbled, refusing to meet her eyes. "You can collect him in an hour." "I'll take him now," Elara stated, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Now, see here, Mrs. Vance," Thorne protested, "there's paperwork." "I have paid for him," Elara cut him off, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. "As you so crudely put it, he is now my property. I will take him now. Or we can wait for Judge Miller to return next month. and you can explain to him why you held on to a man's legal property after the sale was complete. The threat of the circuit judge, a man known for his rigid adherence to the letter of the law and his dislike for small-town corruption, was enough. Thorne's face reddened, but he knew he was beaten. With a sigh of pure exasperation, he pulled a large iron key from his belt and with visible reluctance unlocked the shackles around the man's ankles. He left the wrist restraints in place. "The rest come off when I get that bill of sale," Elara said firmly. She then turned to the man who now, by the twisted logic of this town, belonged to her. For the first time, she addressed him directly. Her voice, which had been so sharp and defiant, softened. "Come with me," she said. The man Kaelen had watched the entire exchange with that same unnerving stillness. He had seen her courage, heard her defense, witnessed her sacrifice. Now he studied her face for a long, silent moment, his dark eyes searching for the truth behind her actions. What he saw there, he alone knew. With a dignity that made the chains on his wrists seem utterly meaningless, he inclined his head in a slight formal nod. He took a step forward, the chains clinking softly, and followed her off the porch. The journey through the town was like walking through a parted sea of hostile waters. The townsfolk scrambled out of their way, their faces a mixture of shock, disgust, and a kind of morbid fascination. They stared as if she were leading a wolf on a leash. "You'll regret this, Elara," Prudence Miller called after her, her voice shrill with righteous indignation. "Mark my words." Elara didn't look back. She kept her eyes fixed on the marshal's office at the far end of the square. Beside her, Kaelen walked with a fluid, measured grace, his bare feet making almost no sound on the dusty ground. She could feel the heat radiating from him, could smell the scent of sweat and earth and something wilder, something untamed. She was acutely aware of the sheer physical power of the man beside her, a power currently held in check by chains and his own iron will. The thought of what she had just done, the enormity of it, began to settle in her stomach like a cold stone. She had invited a stranger, a man condemned by everyone she knew, a man with an unknown past and an unknowable heart, into her life, onto her isolated ranch. She had spent every penny she had to do it. She had made an enemy of the most powerful man in the valley. For a terrifying moment, the whispers of the crowd echoed in her own mind. "Madness! You've signed your own death warrant." But then she glanced sideways at the man walking beside her. He held his head high, his gaze directed forward, ignoring the hate that swirled around them. She saw the raw bleeding flesh on his wrists, and her fear was replaced by a surge of something else, a fierce, protective certainty. She had seen a man worth saving, and as they walked together through the suffocating judgment of Redemption Gulch, a strange and unfamiliar feeling began to bloom in her chest. For the first time in 3 long years, since the day Liam had died, she didn't feel like a victim of her circumstances. She felt like she had a purpose. And that feeling, she realized, was worth more than all the money in the world. It was worth everything. The inside of Marshal Thorne's office was somehow hotter and more suffocating than the town square. The air was stale, thick with the smell of cheap cigar smoke, old paper, and the lingering scent of unwashed bodies from the 2 holding cells at the back. Thorne was behind his desk, scratching out the bill of sale with a pen that seemed to protest with every stroke. He didn't look up as Elara and Kaelen entered the soft clink of Kaelen's wrist chains, an unnaturally loud sound in the small, tense room. Elara stood before the desk, her back straight, her hands clasped in front of her, waiting. Kaelen stood a few paces behind her, a silent, watchful presence that seemed to shrink the already cramped space. "You're sure about this?" Mrs. Vance Thorne asked one last time, his eyes still fixed on the document. He wasn't asking out of concern for her. He was offering her one last chance to back down to restore the town's natural order and save him from the inevitable wrath of Silas Blackwood. "It ain't too late to change your mind. I could find a discrepancy in the bidding. We could say Blackwood's man was first. No one would question it." "Just write the bill," Marshal Elara said, her voice flat and cold. With a final exasperated sigh, Thorne finished the document, scratching his signature with a flourish before slamming an official-looking stamp onto it with far more force than was necessary. There he growled, pushing the paper across the desk. "May the Lord have mercy on your soul, because you surely ain't helping yourself." Elara took the paper, folded it neatly, and tucked it into her purse. She didn't look at it. It was a vile document, a piece of paper that claimed ownership of a human being. But it was also his key to freedom. "The keys, Marshal," she said, holding out her hand. With a snort of pure disgust, Thorne tossed a small rusted key onto the desk. It skittered across the wood and came to rest near her hand. "Don't come crying to me when he slits your throat in your sleep," he muttered. Elara's eyes flashed with a dangerous fire. "The only throat I'm worried about in this town, Marshal, belongs to anyone who tries to set foot on my property without an invitation. Good day." She turned on her heel and walked out, her head held high. Kaelen followed his movements as silent and fluid as a shadow. Once outside on the wooden walkway under the unforgiving glare of the afternoon sun, she stopped and faced him. The noise of the town seemed to have faded, leaving them in a strange, isolated bubble of silence. "I'm going to unlock these now," she said, her voice softer than it had been all day. She held up the key. "I don't expect you'll run. Where would you go? But I won't keep you in chains." "That was never my intention." She reached for his wrists. He held them out slowly, his dark, unreadable eyes watching her every move. She saw then up close the true extent of the damage. The iron had bitten deep into his flesh, creating raw, weeping grooves that were caked with dust and dried blood. A wave of nausea and anger washed over her. Anger at the casual cruelty of it all. Her hands trembled slightly as she inserted the key into the lock. It protested with a rusty squeal, but finally turned. The heavy shackles fell away, hitting the wooden planks with a dull, final clang that seemed to echo down the empty street. A sound of finality. A sound of freedom. The man Kaelen, she remembered his name from somewhere in the haze of the auction, rubbed his raw wrists, the first truly unguarded human gesture she had seen from him. He flexed his fingers, his gaze fixed on the angry red welts that circled his skin. "We'll need to tend to those," Elara said, her voice gentle. "I have salve and clean bandages at the ranch." She paused, then added, "It's about an hour's walk. I don't have a wagon with me today." She hadn't expected to be leaving with a person. He looked up from his wrists, his gaze meeting hers. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something beyond that unnerving stillness. It was a deep, soul-crushing weariness, but it was mingled with a spark of something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or disbelief. He gave a single, curt nod. The walk to the Lone Cypress Ranch was a silent one. Elara led the way, acutely aware of the tall figure walking behind her. She could feel his presence, a steady, watchful energy that was neither threatening nor comforting, but simply there. She tried to make sense of the whirlwind of the last hour. She, Elara Vance, had just spent her life savings to buy a man the town considered a savage, a man she knew nothing about except that he was accused of stealing from Silas Blackwood, a man who had not yet spoken a single word to her. As they left the last dusty buildings of Redemption Gulch behind, the vast empty landscape of the valley opened up before them. The land was beautiful in a stark, brutal way. Rolling hills covered in dry grass, dotted with sagebrush and the occasional stubborn juniper tree. In the distance, the jagged peaks of the mountains clawed at the pale blue sky. This was the land she and Liam had fallen in love with. Now, it just felt empty, lonely. She glanced over her shoulder. Kaelen was keeping pace easily, his long strides eating up the ground. He was looking around, his eyes, scanning the horizon, the ridges, the gullies, not with the idle curiosity of a stranger, but with the keen, practiced assessment of someone who knew how to read the land. He was seeing things she didn't. The track of a coyote, the subtle shift in the wind, the distant circling of a hawk. The silence began to feel heavy, awkward. She felt a sudden absurd urge to fill it, to explain, to justify herself. "I'm Elara," she said, the words sounding loud in the quiet air. "Elara Vance." He didn't respond immediately. He just kept walking, his gaze sweeping the landscape. Just when she thought he wouldn't answer at all, he spoke. His voice was deep and rusty from disuse, like a door that hadn't been opened in years. "They call me Kaelen." It was just a name, but hearing him speak it, hearing his voice for the first time, sent a strange shiver through her. It made him real. He wasn't a symbol of injustice anymore, or a savage or a problem. He was Kaelen. They walked on. The sun began to dip towards the mountains, casting long, distorted shadows across the valley. Finally, they crested the last hill, and the Lone Cypress Ranch came into view below them. Elara felt a familiar pang in her chest, a mixture of stubborn pride and bitter shame. Even in the soft, forgiving light of late afternoon, there was no hiding the ranch's decay. The main house, its unpainted boards weathered to the color of old bone, seemed to be leaning slightly, as if tired of its long fight against gravity. The fence line along the front pasture was a pathetic joke, with more broken posts than standing ones. The barn roof was a patchwork of mismatched shingles and tar paper. She braced herself for his reaction, for a sign of judgment, of disappointment. He had been bought indentured to this failing, broken-down piece of land. But Kaelen simply stopped his eyes, taking in every detail from the crumbling chimney on the house to the single magnificent cypress tree that stood on the ridge, its dark green branches, a stark defiance against the pale sky. He surveyed it all with that same unnerving stillness. Then he looked at the tree, and for the first time, a flicker of something like admiration entered his expression. "It stands alone," he said, his voice still rough but clearer now. "Strong roots." Elara followed his gaze to the tree. Her tree. Liam's tree. "Yes," she whispered, a lump forming in her throat. "It does." In that moment, she felt a fragile, tentative connection form between them. He hadn't seen the decay. He had seen the defiance. He had seen the spirit of the place. And in doing so, he had seen a part of her soul she thought no one would ever see again. The sun had bled into a bruised purple and orange along the western horizon by the time they reached the ranch house. The air was cooling rapidly, carrying the scent of sage and dry dust. As they approached, a deep sense of vulnerability washed over Elara. This small, weathered house was her sanctuary, her fortress against the world since Liam's death. For 3 years, no one but her had stepped across its threshold. Now she was about to lead a complete stranger, a man the world had branded a criminal, into its heart. Her hand trembled as she pushed open the door, its familiar creak sounding like a note of protest in the evening quiet. The inside was sparse but spotlessly clean. A simple wooden table with 2 chairs stood in the center of the main room, its surface scrubbed pale from years of use. A cast-iron wood stove sat cold against one wall, and shelves held a meager collection of dishes and preserved goods. A faded, hand-stitched quilt was draped over the back of a rocking chair near the fireplace. Above the cold hearth on the stone mantelpiece sat a single, tarnished silver frame holding a photograph of a smiling, confident young man, Liam. Kaelen followed her inside, stopping just past the doorway. He moved with a surprising lightness, his presence filling the small space without overwhelming it. His eyes moved slowly around the room, taking in every detail, his expression unreadable. He was like a wild creature brought into a cage, testing the air, assessing the boundaries, alert to any sign of danger. You can sleep in the barn," Elara said, the words coming out more hesitantly than she'd intended. She didn't meet his eyes, busying herself by lighting the oil lamp on the table. The warm yellow light pushed back the gathering shadows, but it also seemed to magnify the room's emptiness. "There's fresh hay in the loft. I have some blankets in a trunk by the door. I'll bring you some supper when it's ready." She expected him to just nod and leave, to accept the arrangement without question. It was more than he would have gotten in a cell or at Blackwood's mine. But he didn't move. She could feel him, standing there, his gaze fixed on her. When she finally summoned the courage to turn and face him, she found he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the photograph on the mantelpiece. "My husband Elara," said quietly, her voice catching. "Liam. He passed 3 winters ago." Kaelen's gaze remained on the photograph for a long moment, as if he were trying to understand the man frozen in time, the man whose presence still permeated every corner of this house. Then he nodded slowly and turned his eyes back to her. There was a depth of understanding in them that startled her. It was the look of someone who was intimately familiar with loss. He moved towards the door, but just before he stepped outside into the twilight, he paused and looked back. His lips moved carefully, as if the words were foreign objects he was still learning how to shape. "Thank you," he said. His voice was low, the rusty edges beginning to smooth out, revealing a rich, deep timbre beneath. Then he was gone, melting into the shadows, leaving Elara standing alone in her kitchen, one hand pressed to her chest, where her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The encounter had unsettled her more than the auction, more than the walk home. His quiet dignity, his perceptive gaze, the simple, profound weight of his gratitude, it was all chipping away at the careful walls she had built around herself. She had intended to buy a symbol to make a stand. She hadn't been prepared for the complex, intelligent, and wounded human being she had brought home. Supper was a simple affair: beans, cornbread, and the last of her canned peaches. As she carried the tray out to the barn, she felt a fresh wave of anxiety. What was she doing? The whole town thought she was mad. And perhaps they were right. The barn loomed ahead, a dark, cavernous shape against the star-dusted sky. She pushed open the heavy door, its groan echoing in the stillness. A lantern cast a pool of soft light in the center of the barn. Kaelen was sitting on a bale of hay, not idle, but working. He had found a broken piece of harness leather and was meticulously mending a split strap with a piece of twine, his long, deft fingers surprisingly nimble. The sight was so unexpected, so domestic, that she stopped in her tracks. He looked up as she approached, his work ceasing. His expression was calm, but his eyes were watchful. "You don't have to work," she began, feeling suddenly awkward. "You're not. This isn't—" He looked from the broken harness in his hands to the dilapidated state of the barn around them, and then back to her. A faint, almost imperceptible hint of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a smile of amusement, but of understanding. The unspoken message was clear: there was work to be done everywhere. It was better to be useful than to be idle. She set the tray down on a nearby crate. Well, she admitted, a genuine smile touching her own lips for the first time that day. "I suppose there's plenty that needs fixing around here." They ate in a companionable silence, a strange sort of peace settling between them in the lantern-lit barn. The barn cats, usually skittish, emerged from the shadows drawn by the smell of food and the quiet presence of the stranger. One brave little calico even rubbed against his leg, and Elara watched as his hand dropped to stroke its head with an unexpected gentleness. That night, as Elara lay in her own bed, the house felt different. For 3 years, its creaks and groans had been the sounds of emptiness, the lonely sighs of a dying dream. But tonight, underneath those familiar sounds, was something new: the knowledge that she was no longer alone on the ranch. A man she barely knew, a man with a past shrouded in pain and prejudice, was sleeping just 100 feet away. It should have terrified her. The entire town expected her to be terrified. Prudence Miller's shrill warning echoed in her memory: "He'll murder you in your sleep." Instead, as she listened to the sound of the wind whispering around the eaves of the house, she felt a strange and unfamiliar sense of security. It was illogical, insane even. But as she drifted off to sleep, she realized it wasn't Kaelen she was afraid of. The real danger didn't come from a silent man with wounded wrists and a dignified soul. The real danger lay outside her fence line, in the simmering hatred of Redemption Gulch and in the cold, patient eyes of Silas Blackwood. And that danger, she knew, would not wait long to make itself known. She had won a battle today, but the war for her ranch and for the life of the man sleeping in her barn had only just begun. The first light of dawn was just beginning to spill over the jagged peaks of the mountains, painting the eastern sky in delicate shades of rose and gray. Elara was already awake, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of steaming coffee. A list of urgent repairs lay on the table in front of her, a testament to years of neglect. The roof of the house leaked in 2 places, the well pump was losing its prime, and the corral fence was so rotten a strong wind could take it down. Each item on the list was a battle, and each required resources, money, materials, strength that she simply didn't have. A familiar wave of hopelessness washed over her. A soft knock at the kitchen door startled her. She looked up to see Kaelen standing on the porch, his silhouette framed by the nascent dawn. He had washed his face and hands and had tied his long, dark hair back with a strip of leather. He looked less like a prisoner now and more like a man ready for a day's work. He held up his hands, showing her the raw but now clean welts on his wrists. Then he gestured toward the dilapidated barn, then to himself, and made a motion like swinging a heavy hammer. "You want to work?" Elara asked, a little taken aback. He nodded, his dark eyes serious. I can't pay you," she said the words, tasting like ash in her mouth. The heat of shame rose in her cheeks. "You have to understand that. I spent everything I had just to—" She stopped, unable to say the words "to buy you." "I mean, I can offer food and shelter, that's all." He listened patiently, his gaze never leaving her face. Then he pointed to the house, to the land around them, and finally to her. He nodded again, a slow, deliberate gesture. The meaning was unmistakable. "You freed me. You stood against them for me. That is payment enough. Elara found herself blinking back a sudden hot rush of tears. In all her life, she had never encountered such simple, profound grace. For the people of Redemption Gulch, everything was a transaction, a measure of profit and loss. For this man who had lost everything, a debt of honor was something real and binding. "Well, then," she said, her voice thick with emotion as she stood up, "I suppose we'd better get started." She led him to the small tool shed behind the house. It was Liam's sanctuary. His tools still hung in their designated places, coated in a fine layer of dust and a creeping web of rust. The sight of them sent a familiar pang of grief through her. Liam had been so proud of his tools, always keeping them sharp and clean. He used to say a man was only as good as the tools he kept. Seeing them neglected felt like another small betrayal of his memory. Kaelen stepped into the shed, and a remarkable transformation took place. The weary, reserved man she had seen thus far was replaced by a craftsman. He moved with a quiet, focused energy, taking down each tool, an axe, a saw, a draw knife, and examining it with a careful, knowing touch. He tested the edge of the axe with his thumb, checked the set of the saw's teeth, and noted the looseness in a hammer's handle. He set aside those that needed immediate repair, his movements efficient and purposeful. When he found Liam's old whetstone still sitting in its wooden box, he looked at her, a silent question in his eyes. "Yes, of course," she said, her voice choked. "Use whatever you need." Soon the forgotten rhythmic sounds of work began to breathe life back into the ranch. The sharp shing, shing, shing of steel on stone as Kaelen sharpened the axe blade. The solid, reassuring thump of a hammer striking wood as he secured the loose handle. For Elara, these were the sounds of hope. They were the sounds of Liam. He decided to start with the corral fence, the most urgent of the large repairs. He worked with a tireless, focused intensity that was both impressive and a little intimidating. He didn't just replace the rotten posts. He dug deeper, set them with rocks for stability, and chose the straightest, strongest lengths of timber from a fallen pile Liam had never gotten around to milling. He moved with an economy of motion, every action precise and effective. There was no wasted energy, no hesitation. He understood wood, understood the mechanics of stress and support as if it were a language he had been born speaking. Elara went about her own chores, feeding the chickens, tending her small vegetable garden, but her attention kept drifting back to him. She watched the powerful flex of the muscles in his back as he swung the post-hole digger. She saw the intense concentration on his face as he sighted along a new rail to ensure it was perfectly straight. He wasn't just working, he was rebuilding. He was taking the broken pieces of her world and one by one making them whole again. When she brought him a dipper of cool water from the well, he drank deeply, his throat working. He handed the dipper back, a sheen of sweat on his brow. "Good tools," he said, his voice still carrying that rough edge of disuse. He nodded toward the shed. "Your man knew good iron." The simple, respectful observation caught her off guard. Liam was particular about his tools, she managed to say. He said a man could build a future with good tools. Kaelen considered this for a moment, his dark eyes looking out at the half-mended fence, at the tired house, at the vast empty land. Then he nodded in agreement. Wise man. That evening, as they ate another simple meal, this time at the kitchen table, Elara had insisted she found herself talking. The words just came. She told him about Liam, about their dream for this place, how they were going to raise horses the best in the valley and build a new house on the ridge right next to the lone cypress tree where they could see the sunrise every morning. She spoke of her family back east in Boston, who had all but disowned her when she'd married a penniless dreamer and followed him west. She told him how after Liam died, their letters had become demands for her to sell the ranch and come home where you belong. They couldn't understand, she said, pushing the beans around her plate with a fork. This was our home, this pile of dirt and broken dreams. To them, it's a failure. To me, it's all I have left of him. She finally ran out of words, the silence in the kitchen thick with her unshed tears. Kaelen had listened without interruption, his attention so complete it was like a physical presence. When she fell silent, he stood and walked to the small kitchen window, looking out at the land as it dissolved into the deep indigo of twilight. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice low and resonant. "The land remembers," he said slowly, each word chosen with care. "It holds the memory of the good times and the bad. It holds the sweat of your man. It holds your tears." He turned from the window to look at her, and his eyes held a profound ancient wisdom. Land waits. It waits for hands that know how to care for it, for hearts that are strong enough to stay. Clara stared at him, the simple poetry of his words striking a deep chord within her. He wasn't just talking about the soil and the trees. He was talking about her. He was talking about them. He was telling her that her struggle, her stubborn refusal to leave, was not a failure. It was an act of faith. In that moment, sitting in her humble kitchen with a stranger, the world called a savage, Elara felt a flicker of a feeling she had thought was lost to her forever. The possibility of a future. Days bled into a week, then 2. A new rhythm established itself at the Lone Cypress Ranch, as steady and natural as the rising and setting of the sun. Kaelen would work from first light until dusk, a silent, tireless force of restoration. The corral fence now stood straight and strong. The barn door, which had hung drunkenly from a single hinge, was rehung and secure. He had even tackled the leaking roof on the house, his shadowy form moving with nimble confidence against the sky as he meticulously replaced the warped shingles. Elara, in turn, found a renewed purpose in her own work. She tended the garden with a vigor she hadn't felt in years, her hands coaxing life from the stubborn soil. The house felt warmer, brighter. In the evenings they would eat together, and the silence between them was no longer awkward but comfortable, filled with the quiet understanding of shared labor and mutual respect. Sometimes he would speak. Never much, but his words were like stones dropped into a deep well, creating ripples of meaning. She learned that his people had been driven from their ancestral lands in the north, forced onto a reservation where the soil was poison and the promises were empty. She learned that he had been taught English at a mission school where the priests had tried to beat the Indian out of him, an effort that had succeeded only in teaching him the profound hypocrisies of the white man's world. He spoke of these things without self-pity, with a quiet factual detachment that was more heartbreaking than any display of emotion. She, in turn, told him more about Liam, sharing anecdotes that brought a sad smile to her face. She described his terrible singing voice, his obsession with finding the perfect cup of coffee, and the way he would read poetry to her by the firelight. In sharing these memories with Kaelen, she found that the sharp edges of her grief were beginning to soften. She was no longer just mourning a ghost. She was celebrating the memory of a man she had loved. This fragile peace, however, existed in a bubble. The world beyond their fence line had not forgotten, nor had it forgiven. When the time came that Elara had to go into Redemption Gulch for supplies, the reality of their situation crashed down on her. The money from the auction was gone, but Kaelen, it turned out, had a small hidden stash of his own, a few silver coins earned from trapping, which he insisted she use. For the ranch, he had said, pushing the small leather pouch into her hand. For us. The word us had echoed in her heart for days. As she walked down the town's main street, a sack of flour in one arm and a list of necessities in her hand, she felt the familiar weight of the town's judgment. Conversation ceased mid-sentence as she passed. Women she had known for years, women who had attended her wedding and sat with her during Liam's funeral, now crossed the dusty street to avoid her, their faces tight with disapproval. Men standing outside the saloon stopped their talk to stare, their eyes filled with a mixture of contempt and a crude, insinuating curiosity. The air was thick with their silent condemnation. It was a suffocating, lonely feeling, but Elara lifted her chin and kept walking. She would not let them see her break. Her last stop was Miller's Mercantile, the general store owned by the parents of Prudence Miller, the woman who had been so vocal at the auction. As she pushed open the door, the little bell above it announcing her arrival, the half-dozen customers inside fell silent. Mr. Miller, a stern, balding man with wire-rimmed glasses, looked up from behind the counter, and his face hardened into a mask of cold disapproval. "What can I get for you, Mrs. Vance?" he asked, his tone making it clear she was no longer a welcome customer but a necessary evil. Elara recited her list: salt, sugar, coffee, lamp oil. As Mr. Miller gathered the items, slamming them onto the counter with deliberate force, she could feel the stares of the other women in the store boring into her back. "I hear you're taking on charity cases now, Elara," one of them, Mrs. Gable said, with a syrupy sweet voice that dripped with malice. "Must be lonely out there on that big ranch all by yourself." "My ranch and my company are my own business," Martha Elara replied, keeping her voice even. "Is it true what they're saying?" Another woman chimed in, her eyes wide with feigned concern. "That you let him sleep in the house. The question hung in the air, ripe with scandalous implication. Elara's face burned, but before she could respond, a new voice cut in. That's enough. It was Sarah Miller, Mr. Miller's wife, a quiet, bird-like woman who rarely spoke up. She emerged from the back room, her face flushed but her eyes firm. Elara is a customer. You will treat her with respect in my store, or you can take your business elsewhere. The other women, stunned into silence by this unexpected defense, quickly paid for their things and scurried out, shooting venomous glares at both Sarah and Elara as they left. Miss Miller looked at his wife with pure astonishment. Sarah, what? In God's name? Be quiet, John, Sarah said, her voice trembling but resolute. She turned to Elara, her expression softening. I'm sorry, Elara. They have no right. She began to wrap Elara's purchases, and as she did, she leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. Just be careful. My husband hears things at the bank. Silas Blackwood is not a man who forgives a public insult. He's been talking to Marshal Thorne. They're looking for a reason, any reason, to ride out to your place. The warning sent a chill down Elara's spine, colder than any winter wind. She knew Blackwood wouldn't let the matter rest, but this was the first confirmation that he was actively plotting against her. Thank you, Sarah, Elara said, her voice filled with a gratitude that went far beyond the simple warning. In a town that had turned its back on her, this small act of kindness felt like a lifeline. As Sarah handed her the wrapped parcels, Elara noticed she had included an extra bag of hard candy. For your ranch hand, Sarah whispered, a faint blush on her cheeks. My boy Thomas, he used to love these. It was a small, clumsy gesture, but it was an acknowledgement of Kaelen as a human being, a man who might enjoy a simple pleasure like candy. Elara left the store with her head held a little higher. The town's hatred was a bitter pill, but Sarah Miller's unexpected courage had been a sweet antidote. It was a reminder that even in a place as hard as Redemption Gulch, decency had not been entirely extinguished. However, the walk home was filled with a new sense of dread. Sarah's warning echoed in her mind. They're looking for a reason. Blackwood and Thorne wouldn't need a real reason. They would manufacture one. They would twist a story, bribe a witness, or simply create a lie out of thin air. She and Kaelen were isolated, vulnerable. The law, which should have been their protector, was being wielded as a weapon against them. That night, as she and Kaelen sat at the kitchen table, she told him what had happened in town about the insults and the warning. He listened in his usual impassive way, but she saw the muscles in his jaw tighten. They will come, he said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. Yes, Elara agreed, her heart heavy. And they won't come to talk. After their meal, she did something she hadn't done since Liam's death. She retrieved his old shotgun from its resting place above the mantelpiece. The steel was cold and heavy in her hands. She took it out to the porch along with the cleaning kit, and with methodical practice movements, she began to clean and oil it. The familiar acrid smell of gun oil filled the night air. Kaelen came out and stood watching her, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. Her hands, which had been steady, began to tremble slightly under his gaze. He taught you to use this, Kaelen, asked his voice, low. He taught me how to survive, Elara replied, sliding a shell into the chamber with a decisive click. He knew this land wasn't as peaceful as he wanted it to be. She leaned the loaded shotgun against the wall by the door. Kaelen nodded grimly. He understood the danger she had placed herself in by taking him in. He understood that this small, isolated ranch was no longer just a home. It was a fortress under siege. That day he had been working on mending a heavy logging chain. Now Elara noticed that he had taken to wearing a blacksmith's hammer on a loop in his belt even when he wasn't working. It was a tool, yes, but in his hand she knew it could also be a formidable weapon. They were preparing for a war they both knew was coming. The only question was when the first shot would be fired. The first test came sooner than they expected, and not in the way they had imagined. It wasn't a manufactured crime or a midnight raid, but something far more insidious. It came on a hot, windless afternoon a few days later. Elara was in the garden weeding the stubborn rows of beans when she heard the sound of approaching horses. It was more than one rider, at least 3 or 4, moving at a confident, unhurried pace. Her heart leaped into her throat. Her hand tightened on the handle of her gardening hoe, the worn wood, a poor substitute for the shotgun leaning by the front door. She forced herself to keep working her back to the road, feigning an ignorance she did not feel. To look up would be to show fear. and she would not give them that satisfaction. The horses stopped at her front gate, the one Kaelen had just finished rebuilding. The silence that followed was heavy with menace. Elara Vance. The voice was unmistakable. Dale Morrison, the owner of the largest ranch in the valley, and a man who had made no secret of his desire to acquire her land. He was a man who worked for Silas Blackwood, his unofficial enforcer. "We've come to check on your welfare." Elara straightened up slowly, deliberately, taking her time to brush the dirt from her hands before turning to face them. Morrison was there, of course, astride a magnificent black horse, his cold eyes and expensive hat, a symbol of his borrowed power. Beside him were the Harmon brothers Jim and Pete, two mean-spirited drunks who found employment as Blackwood's thugs. And to her disgust, Sheriff McKenna was with them, looking uncomfortable and avoiding her gaze, but present nonetheless. His presence gave their intimidation the veneer of official business. "As you can see, Mr. Morrison, I'm perfectly well," she said, her voice as level and cool as she could make it, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. Morrison dismounted his movements, slow and deliberate, his hand resting casually on the pistol holstered at his hip. "You can't blame folks for being concerned," he said, his lips twisting into a smirk. "A decent woman all alone out here with a savage." "His name is Kaelen," the words came out, sharp as shattered glass. "And, as you've just pointed out, I'm not alone." Morrison's face darkened. He wasn't used to being contradicted, especially not by a woman. "You've taken leave of your senses, woman. But I'm a generous man. I'm prepared to help you out of this foolish mess you've made. I'll take that creature off your hands. Turn him over to the mine where he belongs. And I'll give you a fair price for this land, more than it's worth in its current state. You could go back east. Start fresh. Forget all this. My land is not for sale, Mr. Morrison," Elara said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "Everything's for sale, Elara," he sneered. "It's just a matter of price. Get off my property." Her voice was a low, dangerous whisper. Morrison took a threatening step forward, his hand dropping from his pistol to clench into a fist. "You're in no position to be making demands." Suddenly, Kaelen was there. He seemed to materialize out of thin air from the side of the barn where he'd been working. He moved with a silent, fluid grace that was both startling and beautiful. He said nothing. He did nothing overtly threatening. He simply stood slightly behind, and to the side of Elara, a protective, immovable presence. The blacksmith's hammer hung at his belt, catching the afternoon sun. He wasn't just a ranch hand anymore. He was a guardian. The Harmon brothers, emboldened by their numbers and their whiskey, reached for their guns. But McKenna, his face pale, barked, "Hold on." The sheriff looked from Elara's defiant face to Kaelen's silent, formidable stance, and something seemed to shift in his expression. Perhaps it was a flicker of his forgotten duty, or maybe just the pragmatic realization that this was about to escalate into bloodshed he'd have to explain to the circuit judge. "The lady asked you to leave Morrison," he said, his voice strained. "I suggest we do that." Morrison's face flushed a deep mottled red. He shot the sheriff a look of pure venom. "You're taking her side." With that, he spat, gesturing contemptuously at Kaelen. "I'm taking the law's side," McKenna snapped, finding a sliver of his authority. "And the law says a person's got a right to be secure on their own property. This is her property. We are uninvited. Now come on." It was a tense standoff that stretched for a long, silent moment. The Harmon brothers looked uncertainly between Morrison and the sheriff. Finally, with a curse, Morrison turned and remounted his horse. He glared down at Elara, his eyes promising retribution. "This isn't over," he snarled. "When that savage shows his true nature, and he will don't come crying to us for help, because no one will answer." They rode away in a cloud of dust and impotent threats, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. Elara's legs suddenly felt weak, as if her bones had turned to water. She might have fallen if Kaelen hadn't reached out and steadied her with a gentle but firm hand on her elbow. The warmth of his touch spread through her arm, a grounding, reassuring force. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. He shook his head, his dark eyes looking down at her with a fierce, protective light. "You stood for me," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I stand for you." That night, the unspoken tension in the small house finally broke. The idea of sending him back to the barn, of maintaining the pretense of being merely an employer and a worker after he had stood ready to defend her life, suddenly felt absurd. He was her partner in this fight, her only ally. "There's a room," she said hesitantly, as they cleaned up after supper. "Off the kitchen. It was meant to be a storeroom. But it's empty. You'd be closer. If." She trailed off, flustered by the implications of her own words. Kaelen understood what she was offering and what it cost her to offer it. It was a gesture of complete trust, a final dismantling of the walls between them. He simply nodded his eyes, conveying a gratitude that needed no words. That night, for the first time since Liam had died, Clara slept knowing someone else was under her roof. Not a stranger, not a savage, but a protector. A man who would stand between her and whatever darkness might come calling. And in his small, sparse room off the kitchen, Kaelen Tallbear lay awake listening to the unfamiliar night sounds of the house. He thought of the woman who had looked at a man in chains and seen someone worth saving, the woman who had faced down armed men to defend him. And he made a silent, solemn vow to the spirits of his ancestors that her faith in him would not be misplaced. The ranch was no longer just a place of shelter. It was a home worth defending. And Elara was no longer just his rescuer. She was his reason to stand and fight. The barn raising at the Garrett farm was a testament to the resilient spirit of the frontier. It felt like the entire valley had turned out a sprawling, chaotic, yet purposeful gathering of families who understood that a neighbor's misfortune today could be their own tomorrow. By sunrise, wagons were already kicking up dust on the road, laden with fresh-cut lumber tools and enough food to feed a small army. The women masters of organized chaos set up long trestle tables under the shade of the cottonwood trees, their cheerful chatter a counterpoint to the men's serious discussions about support beams and roof pitches. When Elara and Kaelen arrived, their small wagon carrying a toolbox and 2 apple pies Elara had stayed up late to bake, a momentary hush fell over the assembled crowd. It was the first time they had appeared together at a community event. All eyes went to Kaelen, but this time the stares were different. The open hostility was gone, replaced by a mixture of curiosity, respect, and for some, a lingering uncertainty. Paul Garrett, his face still etched with the memory of the fire, but his eyes clear with purpose, strode over to them, immediately cutting through the awkward silence. He extended his hand not to Elara, but directly to Kaelen. "Kaelen," he said, his voice loud and firm, ensuring everyone nearby could hear. "Glad you're here. We've got the main support beams ready to lift, and I was hoping you'd lend your expertise. I saw the work you did on Mrs. Vance's corral. It's solid as rock." It was a public declaration of acceptance, a deliberate and powerful gesture. Kaelen, who had been bracing himself for rejection, seemed momentarily taken aback. He looked at Paul Garrett's outstretched hand, then clasped it firmly. "I will help build a strong barn," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. The work began in earnest, a symphony of sawing, hammering, and shouted instructions under the climbing sun. Kaelen, without any pretense or self-importance, quickly became the anchor of the construction. His quiet confidence and innate understanding of structure were undeniable. He directed the raising of the massive central beams, his calm voice cutting through the noise, ensuring the dangerous work was done safely and efficiently. "Easy now," he'd call out. "Tom, a little to your left. Mr. Olson, hold your end steady." The men, many of whom had spat the word savage just weeks before now, listened and responded without question. They saw not an outsider, but a master craftsman. Elara worked alongside the other women, serving food, fetching water, and tending to the children. But she couldn't help but steal glances at the barn at Kaelen. A fierce protective pride swelled in her chest. She saw him not just working, but being woven into the very fabric of the community. She saw young Tom Bradley, the doctor's son, sticking close to Kaelen's side, his face alight with admiration as he soaked up Kaelen's quiet instructions. She saw old Lars Olson, a man of few words, share his water canteen with Kaelen, a simple act of fellowship that spoke volumes. Around midday, Martha Garrett called a halt for the noon meal. The tables groaned under the weight of the feast. As the hungry, sweat-soaked men lined up, Elara watched with a lump in her throat as a space was naturally made for Kaelen among them. He sat on a hay bale between Paul Garrett and Doc Bradley, who to Elara's surprise was engaging him in a serious conversation. "That method you used for jointing the main beams," Doc Bradley was saying, gesturing with a piece of fried chicken. "It's ingenious. I've never seen it done that way." Where did you learn it? My people build lodges to stand against heavy snow and high winds, Kaelen replied, simply after swallowing a bite of cornbread. The wood must be joined to give, not to break. Different trees, same spirit. Sheriff McKenna, standing nearby, overheard the exchange and nodded thoughtfully. He looked over at Kaelen with a new appraising expression. He was seeing not just a former prisoner, but a man of knowledge. The afternoon's work was fueled by a sense of shared accomplishment. The barn's skeleton rose against the blue sky, a symbol of rebirth and cooperation. As the sun began to dip low, casting long golden rays across the valley, the final roof beam was hammered into place. A ragged but heartfelt cheer went up from the exhausted crowd. Paul Garrett, his face grimy with sweat and dirt, climbed onto a stack of planks, holding up a hand for silence. Friends, neighbors, he began, his voice thick with emotion. Look at what we've done today. We've raised more than just a barn. We've raised up a friend in need. He paused, and his gaze swept the crowd until it landed on Kaelen. But I have something more to say, Paul continued, his voice growing stronger. A few weeks ago, I stood among those who would have judged a man based on fear and ignorance. I listened to ugly words and let them poison my heart. The crowd grew very still. I was wrong. He looked directly at Kaelen. Samuel Tallbear risked his life to save my little girl when this barn was an inferno. He ran into the flames while the rest of us stood frozen. He asked for nothing in return. And today, he has worked with the strength and skill of 10 men to help me rebuild. He has shown me and all of us what it truly means to be a neighbor. Paul raised the tin cup of cider he was holding. So I ask you to join me in a toast to Samuel Tallbear, a man who met our hatred with dignity and our fear with courage. Friend, you have a home in this valley. To Samuel, the response was a roar, loud and genuine from most. Cups and hats were raised all around. Kaelen stood frozen, completely overwhelmed by the public display. Elara instinctively moved to his side, her hand finding his. He squeezed it tightly, drawing strength from her. Speech! Someone shouted, and the cry was taken up by others. Kaelen looked at Elara, a moment of panic in his eyes. She gave him a small, encouraging nod. He took a hesitant step forward, the crowd falling silent to hear him. Thank you, he began, his voice carrying in the still evening air. Where I come from, building a home for a family is a sacred thing. Today we have built more than a shelter for animals. We have built understanding. He chose his words with care. I know some may still carry doubt in their hearts. Fear is a shadow that is hard to banish. But I will say this, I am here to be a good neighbor. My hand is open to any who will take it in friendship. His gaze swept the crowd, lingering for a moment on the few, like the Harmon brothers who still looked sullen and unconvinced. We may look different, but we share the same sun, the same rain. We share the same hope for our children and the same need for community. These things, he finished, his voice resonating with quiet power, make us more alike than our differences make us apart. The silence that followed was profound. Then, old Lars Olsen began to clap, and soon the air was filled with a wave of heartfelt applause. As the gathering began to break up, a line of people formed to speak with Kaelen, to shake his hand, to offer him a share of their tobacco, to thank him. As they finally made their way to their wagon in the deepening twilight, little Emma Garrett came running up, her mother hurrying behind her. Mr. Samuel, she cried, holding out a small, crudely stitched doll made of corn husks. I made this for you. It's a guardian angel to keep you safe. Kaelen knelt down to the child's level, his large, calloused hands gently accepting the small gift. His weathered face softened with an emotion so tender it made Elara's heart ache. Thank you, little warrior, he said, his voice thick. I will treasure it always. As they drove home in the fading light, a deep, peaceful contentment settled over Elara. Today had been more than a victory. It had been a transformation. The man beside her was no longer a savage, an outcast. He was Samuel Tallbear, their neighbor. Today was good, Samuel said quietly, breaking the silence, as their own ranch came into view. Yes, Elara agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder. Better than I ever dared to hope. It started with you, Samuel said, his voice a low murmur. This acceptance, this chance, it all started because you looked at a man in chains and saw something worth saving. You earned this yourself, Samuel, she protested softly. With your courage and your dignity. We earned it together, he corrected her. You and me. Partners. The word hung in the air between them, weighted with a meaning that went far beyond the work of the ranch. As he helped her down from the wagon in the warm lamplight spilling from their home, his hands lingered at her waist. Their eyes met, and in the depths of his gaze, Elara saw not just gratitude, but a profound, heart-stopping tenderness that mirrored the feelings blossoming in her own soul. The war wasn't over. She had seen the look of pure hatred on Dale Morrison's face as he watched from the edge of the gathering, but tonight they had won a crucial battle. They were no longer alone. And as they walked into the small, welcoming house together, Elara knew with a certainty that filled every part of her being that she was finally truly home. The autumn chill had begun to creep into the evenings, a subtle reminder that the seasons were turning. The day of the barn raising felt like a turning point in more ways than one. A fragile truce had settled over the valley. There were still those who looked at Samuel with suspicion, who muttered behind their hands when he and Elara rode into town, but the open hostility had largely subsided, replaced by a grudging respect. The story of the fire and Samuel's heroism had taken root, and for many it had choked out the weeds of prejudice that Silas Blackwood had so carefully cultivated. Tonight a brisk wind whispered around the corners of the ranch house, carrying the scent of pine from the high country and the promise of coming winter. Inside, a fire crackled cheerfully in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Elara and Samuel sat at the kitchen table, a pot of tea steaming between them, the comfortable silence of the evening wrapping around them like a warm blanket. But underneath the quiet, a different kind of energy was building, a sense of things left unsaid, of a connection that had deepened beyond partnership into something far more profound and terrifying. "Tell me about them," Elara said, softly breaking the silence. "Your family, if you want to." Samuel had been staring into the fire, his face a mask of old sorrows. He looked at her, and the protective walls he usually kept in place seemed to dissolve in the warm firelight. "It is good to speak their names," he said, his voice low. "It keeps their spirits from fading." He set down his teacup, and his gaze went distant back to a time and a place that no longer existed. "My father was named Strong Elk. He was a war chief, but not in the way your people think of it. His strength was not just in fighting, but in providing. He made sure the elders were warm in winter and the children never went hungry. He could be fierce as a mountain cat when protecting our people, but with my mother, he was as gentle as a summer rain." A sad, tender smile touched his lips. "My mother, her name was Singing River. When she sang the old songs, even the warriors would weep. She knew every plant, every root. She taught me which ones would heal a fever and which would soothe a wound. She taught me how to read the clouds for a coming storm." His voice hitched, and the smile faded. Her laughter. "I miss her laughter, most of all." Elara reached across the table, her hand covering his. He didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his large, calloused hand over and laced his fingers through hers. Their hands, one pale and slender, the other dark and weathered, rested on the worn wood of the table, a bridge between two different worlds. "The soldiers came at dawn," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "They said our land was now part of a treaty we had never signed. They said we had to move to the reservation, a dry, barren place they called the agency. My father tried to reason with them to speak of peace, but some of the young men were full of fire and rage. They would not be moved." He squeezed her hand, his knuckles white. "There was a raid on a freight wagon. It was not our band, but the soldiers did not care. All Indians looked the same to them." He fell silent for a long moment, the crackling of the fire, the only sound in the room. Elara's heart ached for the boy he had been. "I had been away on a hunt," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, the way people sound when a memory is too painful to feel. 3 days. When I returned, the village was gone. Only ashes and silence. My parents, my sister, little Fawn, she was only 14 summers, gone. "Oh, Samuel." Elara breathed tears, burning her eyes. "For many moons I was a ghost," he said, his gaze returning from the past to meet hers. "I was filled with a rage that burned hotter than any fire. I wanted revenge. But I knew if I started killing, I would become the savage they claimed I was. So I drifted. I worked on ranches where the owners didn't ask questions. I learned your ways, your language. But my heart, it was a hollow stone in my chest, empty." He looked down at their joined hands. Until the day a woman with a fire in her eyes stood in a dusty town square and said, "I see a man worth saving." Tears now slid freely down Elara's cheeks. She thought she had known loss, but his was a chasm, a void, where an entire world had once been. "I lost Liam to a fever," she said, her voice thick and shaky. "It feels so small compared to your loss, but it was my whole world." She found herself telling him the part of the story she had never told anyone, the part she held close like a shard of glass in her heart. It wasn't just the fever, she whispered, looking into the flames. It was a snake bite. Out in the north pasture. He was checking the fences. By the time he got back to the house, the poison was already working. I sent our ranch hand, Billy, to get Doc Adams. But Billy came back an hour later alone. He said the doc was indisposed, drunk, passed out cold. Billy was too scared to do anything else, so he just left. He packed his things and rode out that same night. He didn't want to be around for the dying. She took a shuddering breath. I was alone with him. For 2 days. I tried everything. Poultices, prayers. I bargained with a God who wasn't listening. He died in our bed, holding my hand. He told me to be strong. Her voice broke on a sob. After the funeral, Doc Adams had the nerve to come to me smelling of whiskey and offer his deepest condolences. I wanted to scream. I wanted to take Liam's shotgun but I didn't. I just stood there. And that's what I've been doing for 3 years. Just standing here, watching everything we built fall to pieces. Not standing, Samuel corrected her gently, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. You were fighting. Every day. Alone. That is not weakness, Elara. That is the heart of a warrior. They sat in silence for a long time, the fire burning low, their shared grief and pain, a palpable presence in the room. They were 2 survivors, 2 souls, who had been hollowed out by loss, who had found in each other a reflection of their own sorrow, and in that reflection a strange and profound comfort. I never thought Elara confessed, her voice barely audible, that I would ever feel anything again. After Liam, it was like my heart was frozen, solid, just a block of ice in my chest. And now, Samuel asked softly, his dark eyes searching hers. Elara looked at him, at his strong, weathered face, at the kindness in his eyes, at the man who had faced down hatred and violence to stand by her side. Now she whispered, a small, watery smile touching her lips. The ice is beginning to melt. He lifted their joined hands to his lips and pressed a gentle, reverent kiss to her knuckles. You saved me, Elara Vance, he murmured against her skin. Not just from the chains in the town square. You saved me from the ghost I was becoming. You gave my heart a reason to beat again. We saved each other, Samuel Tallbear, she whispered back. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the chill of the room began to seep in. But for the first time, in a very long time, neither of them felt cold. They had walked through the valley of the shadow of death, each on their own solitary path. But tonight, in this small, quiet kitchen, their paths had finally merged. They were no longer 2 lonely survivors. They were 2 hearts scarred and broken, but beginning finally to heal together. And they both knew with a certainty that needed no words that they would never walk alone again. The days that followed their shared confessions were different. A new intimacy had settled between them, as quiet and natural as the morning mist that settled in the low parts of the valley. The unspoken questions had been answered, the hidden wounds exposed to the healing light of understanding. They were no longer just partners in survival, they were partners in life, their separate histories now woven into a single, stronger thread. The first snow of the season came early, a light dusting that turned the brown hills to a soft, ethereal white overnight. It was a time for turning inward, for preparing for the long, cold months ahead. They worked together to bank the house with sod, to chop a massive pile of firewood, and to ensure the barn was snug and secure for the animals. The work was hard, but it was filled with a sense of shared purpose that made it feel less like a chore and more like the building of a home. One evening, as the snow fell in thick, silent flakes outside, Samuel sat by the fire, carving a piece of cottonwood root. Elara sat in her rocking chair, mending one of Liam's old work shirts, patching the elbows for Samuel to wear. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the whisper of the wind, and the scrape of Samuel's knife on the wood. "I have something for you," he said, his voice low, not looking up from his work. He had been carrying the small, crudely stitched cornhusk doll from little Emma Garrett tucked into his shirt pocket ever since the barn raising. Now he reached into another pocket and pulled out a small, soft leather pouch. He opened it and tipped its contents into his palm. It was an arrowhead exquisitely crafted from a piece of milky white quartz. It seemed to glow in the firelight. "My mother made this," he said, his voice thick with reverence. "The winter before she was taken. Among my people, a gift like this is a promise. It is a charm for protection. It means the giver places the receiver's safety and spirit above their own." He held it out to her. "I want you to have it." Elara set aside her, sewing her hands, trembling as she took the arrowhead from him. It was cool and smooth to the touch, yet it seemed to pulse with a life of its own. She knew enough of native customs to understand the profound significance of such a gift. This was not a casual token. It was a piece of his history, a sacred link to the family he had lost. It was a piece of his soul. "Samuel," she whispered, her throat tight with emotion. This is too precious. It belongs to you." "Yes," he agreed simply, his dark eyes finally meeting hers, and the depth of feeling in them made her breath catch. "As are you." Tears pricked her eyes. She closed her fingers around the arrowhead, its smooth, solid shape a comfort in her palm. "Thank you," she managed to say. "I'll treasure it. Always." They sat in silence for a moment, the space between them charged with all the things their hearts knew but their lips had not yet dared to speak. The wind howled outside, a lonely, desolate sound, but inside, in the small circle of firelight, there was only warmth and a powerful unspoken connection. Finally, gathering a courage she didn't know she possessed, Elara stood and walked to where he sat. She knelt on the hearthrug before him so they were at eye level. She took his free hand, the one not holding the carving knife, and held it in both of hers. "When you first came here," she said, her voice soft but steady, "I thought I was saving you. I thought it was an act of charity, a way to fight back against the town's cruelty, a way to honor Liam's memory." She looked into his eyes, wanting him to see the absolute truth of her words. "I was wrong. I was the one who was drowning, Samuel. In grief, in loneliness, in bitterness. I was the one who needed saving." She lifted his hand and pressed her lips to his rough, calloused knuckles. "You didn't just rebuild my fences and my barn. You rebuilt me. You taught me how to hope again. You taught me how to live again, not just survive." "Elara," he breathed, his voice rough, with an emotion he could no longer contain. She leaned forward, her heart pounding a wild, triumphant rhythm, and pressed her lips to his. It was not a hesitant, questioning kiss. It was a kiss of certainty, of homecoming. It tasted of wood smoke and tea, of shared sorrow and newfound joy. It was a kiss that sealed the promise of the arrowhead, a promise of protection, of partnership, of love. He dropped his carving and his knife, his hands coming up to cup her face, his touch gentle, reverent. He kissed her back, and in his kiss she felt the silent strength of the lone cypress tree, the deep, abiding wisdom of the land, and the fierce, unwavering loyalty of a warrior's heart. The future was still uncertain. They both knew that Silas Blackwood's hatred had not vanished with the first snow. He was a patient predator, and his desire for her land and for revenge would not be easily thwarted. The town's acceptance was fragile and could turn with the changing winds of fortune. The world outside their small ranch was still a hard and unforgiving place. But as they held each other in the warm, flickering light of the fire with the winter storm raging outside, none of that mattered. They had found each other in the dust and despair of Redemption Gulch, a woman who had lost her future and a man who had lost his past. And together, against all odds, they had built something new, something strong, something worth fighting for. Outside, the lone cypress tree on the ridge stood tall against the storm, its branches coated in a layer of pristine white snow, its deep roots holding fast in the frozen earth. Like the tree, Elara and Samuel had weathered the harshest of seasons. They had stood alone, and now they stood together. And they knew with a certainty that settled deep in their bones that whatever storms were yet to come, they would face them as one, their love, a fire that no winter wind could ever extinguish. The story of the savage and the widow was over. In its place, the story of Samuel and Elara, a story of love and redemption, was just beginning.